G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. Today we are looking at something slightly different to my usual team selection and race week preview videos. There's been a big breakthrough in understanding F1 Fantasy's price change algorithm, which was announced by F1 Fantasy Tools not long after the conclusion of the Australian Grand Prix. So we're going to get right into this and dissect all you need to know about what this means for your fantasy lineups, how to build budget, and ultimately how that should dictate our team structure in the weeks ahead. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. So for those of you locked in on the F1 Fantasy community on Twitter, F1 Fantasy Tools, the objectively best resource for F1 Fantasy out there, put out a post recently confirming that one of their members in their Discord, Max Alive, was able to synthesize and understand what dictated price changes for drivers and constructors every single week. Now, there's a tweet here which I've got up on the screen, which I'll let you read through in your own time. There's a number of tweets that break out the crux of the price changes in this thread. But essentially, the genesis of the breakthrough stemmed from drivers and constructors being broken into 3 tiers. And those tiers would base the prices for which they were assigned after each race week as a result of the scores they achieved in that race week. So it is quite interesting, quite fascinating how and why drivers are assigned those prices, particularly because of some of the changes, some puzzling more than others that we've seen this season. But this certainly makes a lot more sense now that we have a little bit more context as to what is causing those changes week to week. So as I mentioned, the drivers and constructors are bucketed into 3 different tiers. The A tier for drivers and constructors priced above 25 million. So in the driver's case, it's Max Verstappen. Then in the B tier, which are for assets between 15 million and 24.9 million, we have the McLaren duo, we have Sergio Perez, we have P1 and P2 from Australia, Leclerc and Sainz, we have the Brits, Lewis Hamilton and George Russell, and we have Fernando Alonso. And then in the C tier, which is every driver priced under 15 million, is just about every other driver on the grid other than the ones I've just listed. So I think it is quite interesting, although generally makes a lot of sense with the groupings of these drivers and constructors as to why they are moving directionally for their prices week to week. For the constructors, a pretty similar story, if I'm completely honest. Red Bull in a class of its own, the A tier priced above 25 million. Then we have McLaren and Ferrari, both who drove very well in Australia, as well as Mercedes in the B tier. And then in the C tier is every other constructor you can see here on your screen. So I think it is relatively fairly priced. Whether or not I agree with the methodology entirely, I'm not so sure about, and would probably need to spend a little bit more time dissecting that. But I think it's great that we have some granularity around what is actually driving those changes, because up until this point, as I said, there wasn't a lot of transparency from F1. In many respects, it's probably not a bad thing that they've kept that close to their chest, but it's great to see members of the community really taking the time to break the numbers down and ultimately provide us with some additional context as to what's causing the movements in prices week to week. So one of the terms that came out of the analysis done by Max Alive, F1 Fantasy Tools, and another member in their Discord, Andy Tails, who coincidentally won the F1 Fantasy Hub League a couple of seasons ago, was what was coined as normalized points, and how these normalized points affect the price changes for drivers and constructors every single week. I know there's a little bit of math on the screen, and for those of you that don't love numbers, bear with me for a moment, but I'll do my very best to explain these changes as simply as possible. I know it does look a little complicated just looking at a table of random numbers without much context, but essentially the normalized points for each driver and constructor, what they score that week falls into 5 categories. We have 5 ranges: very bad, which is less than 0. We have 0 to 0.5 normalized points, which is considered bad. We have average, which is 0.5 to 1.5 normalized points. We have good, which is between 1.5 and 3 normalized points. And then anything above 3 normalized points is considered very good. And you can see here in the tiers we've got for A, B, and C, the ones in the question marks are estimated, as we haven't seen price changes in that normalized points range yet this season. But for every other normalized points outcome, we've seen driver changes and constructor changes in price based on their performance in that particular week. So one such example, I've got a couple of examples on the screen here, but before we get into how that is calculated, essentially the equation for calculating normalized points is what the asset scores in that week divided by the average asset score. And the average asset score is the average of all, say, drivers in the driver class averaged across the 20 drivers. So let's say, for argument's sake, we have 400 points scored by all 20 drivers that race weekend. The average asset score is 20, i.e. 400 divided by 20 equals 20, which would be your average asset score for that week. So if we take Australia, for example, where Lance Stroll, a C tier asset, scored 16 points, the average asset score for all drivers was 9.8. We can find that out by going over to F1 Fantasy Tools. So just bear with me for a quick second. And we can go to their website. At the very bottom for the week, they have the average asset score for all drivers, 9.8. And we can see Lance Stroll's score of 16 here for Australia. So we come back to the screen here, and Lance Stroll, a C tier asset with 16 points, divide that by 9.8 for the average asset score, and that gives us 1.6 normalized points. Now, if we go over to the table, I've highlighted in Aston Martin green where that 1.6 sits within the normalized points range, what would be considered a good score for a C tier asset. And if you sit within that range as a C tier asset, you would receive a price increase of 1 million, which is what he received after the Australian Grand Prix. On the contrary, Mercedes, not such a great weekend for them. Double DNF for Lewis Hamilton and George Russell. Again, we'll do the same math. Minus 17 for Mercedes. So if we bring them up on the F1 Fantasy Tools website, they had a minus 17 in Australia for an average asset score of 25.8. So if we come back to my screen here, you can see Mercedes minus 17 divided by the 25.8 equals negative 6.6 normalized points, which if we come across to the normalized points table, Mercedes as a B tier asset received a 0.5 price decrease as their normalized points were less than 0. So hopefully that makes general sense. It's taken a little bit of time for me to conceptually understand what's driving the numbers, but hopefully I've done a good enough job to explain those changes at a high level. F1 Fantasy Tools have said that they expect to incorporate this data into their price changes on their website, so we should have a general idea of what to expect in terms of price changes for each driver and constructor before F1 Fantasy have finalized scores and new prices for the race week. So that's just really great to see there. Essentially, what does that mean for our teams? So there's a few key takeaways to think about. Obviously, the standout is the low tier versus the high tier assets. I think what you're seeing in the low tier assets, if we quickly pivot back to the table here, is that when they have a good weekend, their prices increase much more drastically than their counterparts in the A and the B tier. To the contrary, when A tier assets have a bad week, as we saw with Max Verstappen in Australia, they're more prone to a more significant price decrease. Unlike the C tier assets, which if they do quite poorly, a DNF in Lance Stroll's case, the lowest they can drop is 0.2 million. So a great result, I wouldn't say a great result, but reassuring to see that the worst that someone like Lance Stroll can receive after a bad weekend is a 0.2 million price drop. I think something to also consider is that in order to build your budget, certainly at this stage of the season, you want to take advantage of those underpriced assets before they move into higher tier classes. I think the standout assets, as I've mentioned, are the Ferrari assets, all three of them, Aston Martin, Lance Stroll, even perhaps the Haas duo of Nico Hülkenberg and Kevin Magnussen. Particularly Aston Martin, they're on the precipice of moving into the B tier, so maybe think about bringing them in for Japan if you're looking to build budget. But I think something to think about is also whether or not you want to chase value versus scoring points. I think something at this early of the season, making sure you're in a position to build budget early and get ahead of your counterparts is key. Whether or not I can say with absolute certainty that's the approach to take, I don't know yet. And I don't want to suddenly say something that after a couple of weeks is ultimately proven wrong. I'm someone that likes to take a bit of a hybrid approach to building budget. So have assets that are likely to go up in price, have a couple of cash cows like Lance Stroll in an Aston Martin, which I think is certainly quite strong at the moment. Fourth best car in my opinion, probably just edging Mercedes after what we've seen. But I think there is a lot of value to be had in Ferrari as well, and even the Haas guys, which look to be very reliable. But I think you're also compromising on owning assets like Red Bull, like Sergio Perez, for instance, by chasing other value assets, or even Max Verstappen, even after his DNF. Speaking of Max Verstappen, even though he did go down 0.7 million, the highest he can go in one race week, even with a great result, is 0.2. So I think that's very reassuring to know that even if he has dropped quite significantly, he's going to need 3 to 4 races to get back to the price he was just at before Australia. So I don't think that necessarily means you need to move for Max Verstappen immediately just to recover a reliable asset in your team. So yeah, whether or not chasing value warrants deploying a chip like the wildcard, I think is very team dependent and also subject to the type of way you play the game. I know there's going to be opportunities later in the season where we see a shift in the template like we saw last season with Aston Martin and McLaren. I fully expect something like that could well happen again as our budgets change quite drastically. So I don't necessarily think it's absolute must use, but do I think there is a case to be made for using the wildcard? Certainly if you want to chase budget. I think if you're looking to get in triple Ferrari, an Aston Martin, Lance Stroll and double Haas, and you've only got, a couple of trades up your sleeve, and you don't have the foundations of that already, then absolutely consider using the wildcard if it means you're taking a -20 or a -30 hit to get that. One thing I will say though is we have the China and Miami sprint weekends coming up, and I definitely think there's a case to be made for Max Verstappen as our 2x DRS boost. Given his performance in those race weekends, I think over 2 racing sessions, if we include the sprint on the Saturday and the Grand Prix on the Sunday, Max more often than not is going to be in the podium places, if not on par for the win, just about every time, or certainly has the best shot among all drivers to win both of those sessions. Do I think Charles Leclerc is going to win both of those? Probably not. He might win one. He might have a second and a third. But I think Max's upside over sprint weekends certainly warrants more consideration than just having him on a normal weekend. And I know the template is currently moving away from him because of the fact we've got more value to unlock in Ferrari assets, for instance. But I think that's just something to consider because Max over a 2 race session weekend is probably slightly better and more reliable than, say, a Ferrari asset or a Checo Perez. That's just my opinion. Let me know down in the comments below if you have a different opinion on that. The last thing I wanted to look at quickly was just what a team could look like with just purely value assets. Now, this is my team currently, and I still think I'm in a pretty reasonable position to run something like this for Japan. But hypothetically speaking, if you're focused on building budget strictly and you want to get ahead of that, immediately worry about chasing points later in the season once you've got more budget and more financial flexibility to bring in more assets, then think about a team that could be built more around a triple Ferrari combination. So that could be in 2 moves going from Red Bull and Albon to Aston Martin and Sainz. If you've got 3 transfers handy, you could also look at getting that other budget slot replaced running what looks like a triple Ferrari, double Aston Martin, double Haas lineup. I actually don't mind this at all. I think all very reliable, experienced drivers, and you can see here every single one of them went up after Australia. I do think Sauber, if they can fix that wheel nut issue, probably is due for a price rise at some point too, but that is a very big if, given these guys spend more time in the pits than they do on the track. But I think this is probably the best budget building team as it stands right now, just because of what we've seen so far this season. Aston Martin looks solid. Stroll is in a very competitive car. He just has to stay on the track. And again, reliability for Lance Stroll is a bit of a problem. But if he can just keep it on track and just doesn't DNF, he's on for a pretty decent shot at scoring at least 7 to 8 points most race weeks. And I think that's going to be enough more often than not to get that $0.5 million increase at the very least. But that's kind of where my head's at right now. Just wanted to get a little bit of a download. But let me know your thoughts on whether or not your approach at this point in the season is more focused towards building budget or focused on maintaining that reliable points base that someone like a Red Bull constructor is going to provide this early in the season. But I'm going to leave it there for now, guys. Just wanted to get something down on paper. I would say on paper, but it's not really on paper. And a big shout out once again to F1 Fantasy Tools, Max Alive and Andy Tails for bringing this all together and making it super beneficial for us in the F1 Fantasy community for understanding how prices change and what that means for our teams moving forward. Be sure to drop a like on the video if you haven't done so already. I'll be back with my race week preview closer to the Japanese Grand Prix. But thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all very soon.